85% of all species on Earth disappeared, not over 1 million years, in a geological instant. This is not the extinction of the dinosaurs. This happened 280 million years before them, and it was bigger. The second largest mass extinction in the history of complex life on this planet. And here is what makes it genuinely unsettling. Scientists are still not certain what caused it. One of the leading candidates is not an asteroid, not a volcano, but the explosion of a dying star several thousand light-years from Earth. A gamma-ray burst aimed directly at our planet that could have destroyed the ozone layer in a matter of seconds. This is the only mass extinction in Earth's history that may have come not from this planet and not even from this solar system. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel. Your support makes this work possible. Thank you. Ask almost anyone to name a mass extinction, and they will say the same thing: the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It is the extinction event that has a Hollywood franchise, a clear villain, a precise date, and an emotionally resonant cast of victims. Ask the same person about an extinction that happened 280 million years earlier, that eliminated a larger percentage of life on Earth, and whose ultimate cause remains one of the most contested questions in paleontology. And you will almost certainly get a blank stare. This is the strange asymmetry of public memory in the history of mass extinction. The event that ended the dinosaurs is famous. The event that came before it, and that did more damage, has nearly vanished from common knowledge. Not because it was less significant, but because it happened so long ago, in a world so unfamiliar, that there is no charismatic megafauna to mourn, and no simple, single-cause story to tell. This is the Late Ordovician mass extinction, and it deserves far more attention than it receives, for reasons that go well beyond its scale. It occurred approximately 445 to 443 million years ago, at the boundary between the Ordovician and Silurian periods. And it eliminated approximately 85% of marine species, a figure higher than the 76% typically cited for the end Cretaceous extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. By most quantitative measures of biodiversity loss, the Late Ordovician event ranks as the second most severe mass extinction in the history of animal life, exceeded only by the end Permian extinction approximately 100 million years later. And unlike every other member of the canonical Big Five mass extinctions, the Late Ordovician extinction remains genuinely unsolved. There is no asteroid impact crater of appropriate size and age, as there is for the end Cretaceous event. There is no smoking gun volcanic province of unambiguous scale, as there is for the end Permian event. What there is, instead, is a genuine scientific mystery, competing hypotheses, conflicting lines of evidence, and at least one proposed cause so exotic that it places the Late Ordovician extinction in a category entirely its own among the major extinctions of Earth history. The hypothesis that a burst of gamma radiation from a dying star somewhere in the depths of the galaxy struck the Earth and triggered a chain of consequences that nearly halved the diversity of life in the ocean. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, it is necessary first to understand what existed before the extinction struck. because the late Ordovician world, immediately prior to the catastrophe, was experiencing one of the most significant biological expansions in the history of life on Earth. This expansion is known to paleontologists as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE, and it represents a second wave of evolutionary radiation that followed and substantially exceeded the diversification of the Cambrian explosion more than 50 million years earlier. Where the Cambrian explosion had been primarily about the invention of new body plans, the appearance for the first time of the basic anatomical architectures that would define animal life for the rest of Earth's history. The Ordovician radiation was primarily about diversification within those body plans, an explosion of species-level and genus-level diversity within the phyla that the Cambrian had already established. The marine world of the late Ordovician, in the tens of millions of years before the extinction, was a place of extraordinary biological richness, organized around ecological structures that, while built from unfamiliar organisms, would be recognizable in their general logic to a modern marine ecologist. Reef ecosystems, built not by the scleractinian corals that construct modern reefs, but by tabulate and rugose corals working in concert with stromatoporoid sponges and bryozoans, covered extensive areas of shallow tropical and subtropical seafloor, creating three-dimensional habitat structures that supported diverse communities of associated organisms in much the way that modern coral reefs do. Brachiopods, shelled, filter-feeding organisms superficially similar to bivalve mollusks, but anatomically quite distinct, were the dominant shelled invertebrates of the Ordovician seafloor, with hundreds of genera occupying nearly every available niche from the shallowest intertidal zones to the deep continental shelf. Trilobites, the iconic arthropods of the Paleozoic, had diversified into an extraordinary range of ecological roles by the late Ordovician, burrowing detritivores ploughing through soft sediment, active predators with large compound eyes adapted for hunting in open water, blind specialists adapted to deep or turbid environments, and pelagic forms that spent some or all of their lives swimming in the water column rather than crawling on the seafloor. This last group, the pelagic trilobites, would prove to be of particular significance to the story of the extinction, because their distinctive ecology placed them in a position to be disproportionately affected by whatever was about to strike the Ordovician world. Above the trilobites, in the open water column, the most visually striking predators of the Ordovician Ocean cruised through environments with no fish of any significant size to compete with them. The orthoconic nautiloids, relatives of the modern nautilus, but with long, straight, conical shells rather than coiled ones, included species reaching lengths of several meters, the largest active predators that had yet evolved on Earth. Endocerus, one of the largest of these nautiloids, is estimated to have reached lengths approaching 6 meters. A genuinely enormous predator patrolling the Ordovician seas at a time when vertebrate life was still represented mainly by small, jawless, armored fish, only beginning their long evolutionary journey toward the diversity they would eventually achieve. Graptolites, colonial organisms related, surprisingly, to the same broad lineage that includes modern vertebrates. Though their colonial, planktonic lifestyle made them utterly unlike anything in the modern ocean, drifted through the surface waters of the Ordovician seas in vast numbers. Their delicate branching skeletons of organic material building intricate colonial structures that, after death, settled into seafloor sediments and left behind some of the most useful index fossils in the entire geological record. Because graptolite species evolved and went extinct relatively rapidly, and because their planktonic lifestyle allowed them to disperse across entire ocean basins, the sequence of graptolite species through the rock record provides geologists with one of the most precise tools available for correlating the age of marine sediments across vast geographic distances. A biostratigraphic ruler that has proven essential for reconstructing the precise timing of the extinction event itself. To walk through the late Ordovician seafloor in detail is to encounter a community of organisms that, while utterly unfamiliar in their specific anatomy, occupied ecological roles that a modern marine biologist would immediately recognize in functional terms. Predators, grazers, filter feeders, burrowers, and reef builders, each filling a niche in a complex web of biological interaction that had taken tens of millions of years to assemble. The trilobite Flexicalimain, among the most common and widely distributed trilobites of the late Ordovician, exemplifies the generalist, mobile, benthic predator-scavenger lifestyle that characterized a large fraction of trilobite diversity during this period. These animals, typically reaching several centimeters in length, possessed the ability to enroll completely into a tight ball when threatened, a defensive behavior whose evolutionary signature, distinctive curled fossils preserved in the rock, provides direct evidence of active predation pressure in Ordovician marine ecosystems. Since such a defense mechanism would have evolved and persisted only in the presence of predators capable of exploiting an unrolled, vulnerable trilobite. Larger, more specialized predatory trilobites, equipped with enlarged compound eyes containing hundreds of individual lenses, patrolled the water just above the seafloor, or, in some lineages, ventured into the open water column itself, hunting smaller arthropods, worms, and the larvae of other marine invertebrates. The reef ecosystems of the late Ordovician, while built from organisms entirely different from the scleractinian corals of the modern world, achieved a level of three-dimensional structural complexity that supported biodiversity in much the same manner that coral reefs do today. Tabulate corals, characterized by their distinctive horizontal internal partitions, grew in colonial mats and mounds, while rugose corals, solitary or colonial organisms, named for the wrinkled, horn-like external texture of their skeletons, added additional structural complexity. Stromatoporoid sponges, organisms whose calcified skeletons could form massive, dome-shaped structures reaching meters in diameter, were frequently the dominant reef-building organisms in many Ordovician reef systems, their accumulated skeletal material forming the structural framework around which the rest of the reef community assembled. Bryozoans, colonial filter-feeding organisms constructing intricate, lace-like calcareous skeletons, added further textural complexity, creating microhabitats exploited by an enormous diversity of smaller organisms, tiny crustaceans, worms, and the larvae of larger animals seeking shelter within the reef's structural nooks and crevices. Crinoids, echinoderms related to modern sea stars and sea urchins, but adapted to a sessile, filter-feeding lifestyle, anchored to the sea floor or to reef structures by a flexible stalk and reaching upward into the water column with feathery, food-gathering arms, were extraordinarily abundant throughout Ordovician seas, to the extent that their disarticulated skeletal plates, known as columnals, form a major constituent of many Ordovician limestone deposits, sometimes accumulating in such quantities that the resulting rock is essentially a compressed mass of crinoid debris. A single, healthy patch of Ordovician seafloor could support crinoid gardens of remarkable density, their stalks swaying in the current like a forest of stone flowers, filtering plankton and organic particles from the passing water in numbers sufficient to leave a lasting geological signature across entire sedimentary basins. Above this richly structured benthic world, the open water column hosted its own distinct ecological theatre. The orthoconic nautiloids, already discussed for their impressive size, represented only the largest and most visually dramatic members of a diverse cephalopod fauna that included smaller, more agile coiled and curved forms, all employing jet propulsion generated by expelling water through a specialized siphon to move through the water column in pursuit of prey or in flight from larger predators. These cephalopods were almost certainly the apex predators of the Ordovician open ocean, occupying an ecological role roughly analogous to that filled by sharks and large predatory fish in modern marine ecosystems, a role that, in the complete absence of any jawed vertebrate predator of comparable size, the cephalopods had to themselves, unchallenged by any competing lineage, for tens of millions of years. The graptolite colonies drifting through the surface and near-surface waters represented, in modern ecological terms, something analogous to a planktonic foundation species, not primary producers themselves, since graptolites were filter-feeding colonial animals rather than photosynthetic organisms, but an enormously abundant component of the zooplankton community, whose colonies, in some Ordovician deposits, are preserved in such density that individual rock surfaces can be covered with dozens or hundreds of overlapping graptolite specimens, a testament to just how thoroughly these organisms had come to dominate the pelagic ecosystem of the period. Beneath them, in the true planktonic primary producer role, single-celled photosynthetic organisms, including various groups of acritarchs, organic walled microfossils, whose precise biological affinities remain only partially resolved, but which almost certainly represent the cyst stages of various photosynthetic algae, formed the base of the entire marine food web, fixing solar energy into organic carbon that, through a chain of predation and filter feeding, ultimately supported every other organism in the Ordovician Ocean, from the smallest zooplankton to the largest nautiloid predator. This, in its full ecological complexity, was the world that the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event had constructed, a richly layered, three-dimensionally structured marine ecosystem, populated by representatives of nearly every major animal phylum that exists today, organized into food webs and ecological communities, whose general structural logic, primary producers, filter feeders, grazers, predators, and apex predators, arranged across a complex three-dimensional reef and open water habitat structure, would not seem entirely foreign to an ecologist studying a modern marine ecosystem. However utterly unfamiliar every individual species within that structure would actually appear. It was this elaborate, hard-won biological architecture, the product of tens of millions of years of evolutionary innovation and ecological refinement, that the late Ordovician extinction was about to dismantle. The geography of the Ordovician world, into which this rich and diversifying biosphere had spread, bore almost no resemblance to the modern arrangement of continents. The supercontinent Gondwana, an enormous landmass incorporating the geological material that would eventually become Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, India, and parts of the Middle East and southern Europe, dominated the southern hemisphere, with its southern margin extending across the South Pole itself. Smaller continental fragments, Laurentia, the core of what would become North America, Baltica, the precursor to Northern Europe, Avalonia, a complex terrain that would eventually contribute material to both Eastern North America and Western Europe, occupied scattered positions across a vast global ocean called Iapetus, along with several other minor continental blocks whose precise positions and relationships remain subjects of ongoing geological investigation. For most of the Ordovician period, the global climate had been substantially warmer than today, a greenhouse climate state with high atmospheric CO2 levels, no significant polar ice caps, and sea levels considerably higher than the modern baseline as a consequence. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations during the early and middle Ordovician are estimated, from a combination of geochemical proxies and carbon cycle modeling, to have been in the range of 7,000 parts per million or higher, a concentration roughly 17 times higher than the pre-industrial atmospheric baseline, and a figure that helps explain why a world with the South Pole sitting beneath part of a major continental landmass nonetheless lacked any significant continental ice sheet for most of the period. This was the warm, biologically rich, geographically alien world that the Great Ordovician biodiversification event had built over tens of millions of years. And it was this world that was about to be struck by a catastrophe, whose ultimate trigger remains, even now, a matter of vigorous scientific debate. The late Ordovician mass extinction was not a single event. This is one of the most important and most frequently misunderstood aspects of the catastrophe, and it has significant implications for how scientists have approached the search for its cause. Detailed stratigraphic and paleontological work, accumulated over several decades of research at sites around the world, has established that the extinction unfolded in two distinct pulses, separated by an interval of time substantial enough that the biological communities of the intervening period were measurably different from those that preceded the first pulse. A brief, partial recovery, populated by survivors and opportunistic newcomers, adapted to the changed conditions, before a second wave of extinction struck and compounded the damage. The first pulse of extinction is closely associated in the rock record with the onset of a rapid and severe glaciation, a sudden transition from the warm greenhouse conditions that had characterized most of the Ordovician to an intense icehouse state, with massive ice sheets forming over Gondwana within what appears, geologically speaking, to have been a remarkably short interval of time. This glacial interval, named the Hernantian after the stratigraphic stage that defines the final portion of the Ordovician period, represents one of the most severe and most rapid climatic transitions documented anywhere in the Phanerozoic rock record. The eons spanning the past approximately 540 million years, during which complex, hard-shelled life has existed on Earth in forms preservable as fossils. The second pulse of extinction followed a different mechanism entirely, and it is in some ways the more biologically interesting of the two, because it struck precisely the organisms that had managed to survive and adapt to the glacial conditions of the first pulse. As the Hernantian glaciation came to an end, and the massive ice sheets covering Gondwana began to melt, global sea levels, which had fallen dramatically as enormous volumes of water were locked away in continental ice, began to rise again, rapidly flooding the continental shelves that had been exposed during the glacial maximum. This deglaciation was accompanied by the development of widespread oceanic anoxia, a catastrophic depletion of dissolved oxygen in large volumes of seawater, associated with the upwelling of nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor, and in places frankly toxic water from the ocean depths into shallower environments where it devastated the cold-adapted communities that had only just established themselves during the glacial interval. The organisms that died in the second pulse were, in a profound sense, victims of their own successful adaptation to the first catastrophe. The communities that had managed to survive and even flourish in the cold, glacially influenced conditions of the Hernantian, a distinctive fauna dominated by cold-tolerant brachiopod and trilobite species collectively known to paleontologists as the Hernantia fauna, after the stage in which it is found, were precisely the organisms most vulnerable to the rapid warming, sea level rise, and oxygen depletion that characterized the glaciation's end. Having adapted to one extreme, they were destroyed by the rapid reversal to another. This two-pulse structure, glaciation-driven extinction, followed after partial recovery by deglaciation and anoxia-driven extinction, is now broadly accepted by the paleontological community as the basic architecture of the Late Ordovician catastrophe. What remains intensely debated is what triggered the glaciation in the first place. And it is this question, the question of the ultimate root cause, that has produced the gamma-ray burst hypothesis and its competitors. The Hernantian glaciation itself deserves to be examined in some detail because its sheer magnitude is, on its own terms, one of the most extraordinary climatic events in the history of the planet, independent of any debate about ultimate causation. Geochemical evidence, derived primarily from oxygen isotope ratios preserved in the shells of marine organisms and in other carbonate sediments, indicates that the glaciation was preceded by a dramatic decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide, from concentrations estimated at approximately 7,000 parts per million in the earlier, warmer Ordovician down to approximately 4,400 parts per million by the time of the glacial onset. While this remaining concentration would still be considered extraordinarily high by modern standards, the 60% decline relative to the preceding greenhouse baseline appears to have been sufficient, combined with other contributing factors, to push the climate system across a threshold into a dramatically colder state. The resulting ice sheets, centered on the portion of Gondwana that then occupied the South Polar region, roughly corresponding to the geological material that would eventually become North Africa, are estimated, based on the geographic extent of glacial deposits and associated sea level change, to have reached a peak volume somewhere in the range of 50 to 250 million cubic kilometers. For perspective on the upper end of this range, the entire modern Antarctic ice sheet, the largest single mass of ice on Earth today, contains approximately 26 million cubic kilometers of ice. The Hernantian glaciation, by some estimates, may have involved an ice volume up to 10 times larger than the modern Antarctic ice sheet, an almost incomprehensible quantity of frozen water, accumulated with sufficient rapidity to produce measurable, abrupt changes in the global sea level and ocean chemistry recorded in marine sediments around the world. The consequence of locking such an enormous volume of water into continental ice was a dramatic and rapid fall in global sea level, estimated from the analysis of oxygen isotope shifts that would be required to produce the observed geochemical signal at approximately 100 meters. A 100-meter fall in sea level is a catastrophic event for marine life, particularly for the shallow continental shelf environments where the vast majority of Ordovician marine biodiversity was concentrated. Habitat that had existed for tens of millions of years, supporting the rich biological communities that the Great Ordovician biodiversification event had built, was simply removed from the map, exposed to the atmosphere, eroded, and rendered uninhabitable for the marine organisms that had depended on it. Accompanying this sea level fall was a dramatic drop in tropical ocean temperatures, estimated at approximately 10 degrees Celsius based on oxygen isotope geochemistry, a thermal shift of a magnitude that would, if applied to the modern tropical ocean, transform some of the warmest waters on the planet into conditions more closely resembling the cool temperate zones of today. For organisms adapted over many millions of years to the warm, stable conditions of the Ordovician greenhouse world, a 10-degree drop in ambient ocean temperature, occurring with geological rapidity, represented an environmental shock for which most species had no evolutionary preparation whatsoever. The scientific confidence with which researchers describe the magnitude of the Hernantian glaciation, the 60% CO2 decline, the 100-meter sea level fall, the 10-degree tropical cooling, rests on a body of geochemical and stratigraphic evidence assembled from dozens of research sites spread across every continent that preserves rocks of the appropriate age. And it is worth understanding, in at least general outline, how geologists extract this level of quantitative precision from rock that is 445 million years old. The carbon isotope record provides one of the most important lines of evidence. Carbon exists in nature in two stable isotopic forms, carbon-12 and the heavier carbon-13, and the ratio between them in marine carbonate sediments and in the organic carbon preserved within those sediments shifts in predictable ways in response to changes in the global carbon cycle, including, critically, the kind of large-scale removal of carbon dioxide from the ocean atmosphere system that would be expected to accompany a major glaciation, as carbon is increasingly sequestered in organic matter, or as weathering processes draw down atmospheric CO2. Researchers studying Ordovician Silurian boundary sections in locations ranging from Anticosti Island in eastern Canada to sections in South China, Baltoscandia, and the mid-continent of North America, have documented a pronounced positive excursion in carbon isotope ratios, an enrichment in the heavier carbon-13 isotope, precisely coincident with the glacial interval, a pattern broadly consistent with major disruption to the global carbon cycle of the kind that would accompany the climate transition. The other evidence independently documents the oxygen isotope record, derived primarily from the calcium carbonate skeletal material of marine organisms, including brachiopods and conodonts. The tooth-like microfossil elements of an extinct group of eel-like marine chordates provides the principal quantitative basis for estimating both the magnitude of sea level fall and the magnitude of tropical ocean cooling. Oxygen exists in two relevant stable isotopic forms, the lighter oxygen-16 and the heavier oxygen-18, and the ratio between them in marine carbonate is controlled by two factors operating in combination: the temperature of the water in which the carbonate formed, with cooler water producing carbonate enriched in the heavier isotope, and the total volume of water locked away in continental ice sheets, since the evaporation process that removes water from the ocean to build glacial ice preferentially removes the lighter oxygen-16 isotope, leaving the remaining ocean water and the carbonate skeletons of organisms growing within it increasingly enriched in oxygen-18 as ice sheets expand. By analyzing oxygen isotope shifts in fossil material from locations believed to represent relatively stable tropical conditions, where temperature change can be more confidently isolated from the ice volume signal, researchers have been able to estimate the approximately 10-degree tropical cooling associated with the glacial maximum, while analysis of the combined isotopic shift across a broader range of paleolatitudes has supported the approximately 100-meter sea level fall estimate. The physical evidence for the glaciation itself, as opposed to the indirect geochemical signatures of its climatic and oceanographic consequences, comes from direct sedimentological observation of glacial deposits preserved in rocks that were, during the Ordovician, located at or near the south polar regions of Gondwana. Diamictites, poorly sorted sedimentary deposits containing a chaotic mixture of clay, sand, and larger rock fragments. Characteristic of deposition directly from glacial ice or from sediment-laden meltwater, have been identified at numerous sites across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and other regions that occupied high southern paleolatitudes during the Ordovician. These deposits frequently contain dropstones, isolated, often faceted and striated rock fragments, distinctly out of place within finer-grained surrounding sediment, that are interpreted as having been carried out to sea, embedded within icebergs carved from the Gondwanan ice sheet, eventually melting out and dropping individually to the sea floor as the iceberg disintegrated, leaving behind a telltale large clast surrounded by fine sediment that could not, under normal current conditions, have transported a rock of that size to that location. The striations frequently preserved on the surfaces of these dropstones and on associated glacially scoured bedrock surfaces. Fine parallel scratches produced by rock fragments embedded in moving ice grinding against the underlying surface. provide unambiguous physical confirmation of glacial activity, a category of evidence that does not depend on isotopic interpretation or modeling, but represents direct mechanical traces of ice movement preserved in the rock for nearly 500 million years. The combination of these independent lines of evidence, carbon isotope excursions documenting carbon cycle disruption, oxygen isotope shifts quantifying temperature and sea level change, and direct sedimentological evidence of glacial deposition complete with striated dropstones, is what allows researchers to speak with genuine confidence about the magnitude and rapidity of the Hernantian glaciation, even while the ultimate trigger for that glaciation remains a matter of active scientific contention. The what of the catastrophe is, in this sense, far better constrained than the why, a distinction that is sometimes lost in popular discussion of unsolved scientific mysteries, but that is essential to understanding precisely where the genuine uncertainty in the late Ordovician extinction story actually lies. What makes the Hernantian glaciation genuinely unusual? What marks it out? In the words of researchers who have studied the broader pattern of Phanerozoic glacial events as something close to a unique occurrence in Earth history, is the combination of its severity and its correlation with mass extinction. Earth has experienced numerous glacial intervals across the past 540 million years, including several substantially longer than the Hernantian event. But the Hernantian glaciation stands essentially alone among Phanerozoic ice ages in its direct association with a major biodiversity catastrophe. Other glacial intervals in Earth's more recent history, including the repeated glacial interglacial cycles of the past several million years, the ice ages within which human civilization itself emerged, have not produced comparable mass extinctions, despite involving climatic swings that, while smaller in absolute magnitude than the Hernantian event, were nonetheless globally significant. This anomaly, why this particular glaciation, and only this glaciation, coincided with catastrophic biodiversity loss, is part of what has driven researchers to look beyond simple climatic explanations and consider more exotic triggering mechanisms. The gamma-ray burst hypothesis for the late Ordovician extinction was first proposed in detail in a paper published in the International Journal of Astrobiology in 2004, authored by Adrian Malott of the University of Kansas. Working with paleontologist Bruce Lieberman and several colleagues spanning the disciplines of physics, astronomy, and atmospheric science. The hypothesis represented a genuinely novel approach to the problem of mass extinction causation, an attempt to connect a documented astrophysical phenomenon, gamma-ray bursts, with a specific extinction event in the deep geological past, on the basis of both the general physics of how such an event would affect a planetary atmosphere and the specific paleontological patterns of extinction and survival documented in the Ordovician fossil record. Gamma-ray bursts are, without exaggeration, among the most energetic phenomena known to occur anywhere in the observable universe. A typical gamma-ray burst releases in a period lasting from a fraction of a second to several minutes, an amount of energy comparable to what the Sun will radiate over its entire 10 billion year lifetime. They are produced, according to the best current astrophysical understanding, by two principal mechanisms: the catastrophic core collapse of a massive, rapidly rotating star at the end of its life, producing what is termed a long-duration gamma-ray burst, or the merger of two compact stellar remnants, typically neutron stars, producing a short-duration burst. In either case, the burst is not emitted uniformly in all directions, but is instead beamed into two narrow, oppositely directed jets, concentrating the enormous energy output into a relatively narrow cone of space. This beaming has a crucial consequence for the probability of any given burst affecting a planet like Earth. A gamma-ray burst occurring within range to cause significant atmospheric effects would need to have one of its narrow emission jets pointed with considerable precision at our solar system, a geometric requirement that makes such events, from Earth's perspective, statistically rare, even though gamma-ray bursts themselves occur with some regularity across the observable universe. The Melott and Lieberman team calculated, based on estimates of gamma-ray burst frequency within the Milky Way galaxy, and the geometric probability of a burst's beam intersecting Earth's position, that a gamma-ray burst capable of causing significant biological effects on Earth's surface should occur, on average, roughly once every few 100 million years. A frequency that, while low, is by no means incompatible with the possibility that one such event occurred at some point during the more than 500 million years of complex, fossil-preserving life that Earth's rock record documents. Critically, the proposed mechanism by which such a burst would cause mass extinction does not depend primarily on direct radiation exposure at Earth's surface, which would in fact be substantially attenuated by passage through the atmosphere. Instead, the principal killing mechanism proposed by the hypothesis is indirect and atmospheric. A sufficiently powerful and well-aimed gamma-ray burst striking Earth's upper atmosphere would trigger a cascade of photochemical reactions capable of severely depleting the planet's protective ozone layer. The mechanism works, according to the detailed atmospheric chemistry modeling presented in the original paper and refined in subsequent research, through the production of nitrogen oxide compounds in the upper atmosphere. The intense gamma radiation interacting with atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen molecules would break apart these molecules and drive the formation of nitrogen oxides, compounds that are highly effective catalysts for the destruction of ozone molecules through a well-understood chemical cycle. The model presented by Melott and colleagues suggested that a sufficiently powerful, well-aimed burst could deplete the global ozone layer by as much as 35% on a roughly global scale, with depletion potentially exceeding 50% in some regions, and that this depletion would not recover to pre-event levels for a period that the modeling estimated at approximately 5 to 10 years. The biological consequences of such ozone depletion, occurring over a period of years rather than instantaneously, would flow primarily from the resulting increase in solar ultraviolet radiation reaching Earth's surface, and critically for a marine extinction event reaching the surface waters of the ocean. Ozone in the stratosphere is the primary atmospheric shield against the most biologically damaging wavelengths of solar ultraviolet radiation, particularly the UVB band, which is known to cause direct damage to DNA, to disrupt photosynthesis in plants and photosynthetic marine organisms, and to be broadly harmful to a wide range of biological processes across virtually all domains of life. A sustained, multi-year increase in UVB flux at Earth's surface, of the magnitude the gamma-ray burst model predicts, would be expected to have severe consequences for the base of marine food webs, the photosynthetic phytoplankton that occupy the sunlit surface waters of the ocean and that ultimately support, directly or indirectly, the entirety of marine animal life. This is where the hypothesis connects to a specific and genuinely distinctive pattern documented in the Ordovician fossil record, a pattern that proponents of the gamma-ray burst hypothesis argue is more consistent with a UV radiation-driven kill mechanism than with glaciation or sea level change alone. Among the trilobites of the late Ordovician, researchers have documented a striking and somewhat counterintuitive extinction pattern. Species whose larvae spent portions of their development in the planktonic surface waters, exposed, in other words, to the full intensity of incident sunlight, and, by extension, to any increase in surface ultraviolet flux, suffered dramatically higher extinction rates than species whose larvae developed in benthic, seafloor-associated environments, shielded by the overlying water column from direct surface UV exposure. This pattern runs counter to the typical expectation in mass extinction events, where organisms with broader geographic distributions and more dispersed populations, characteristics generally associated with a planktonic dispersal strategy, tend to fare better than more geographically restricted species, not worse. The fact that the Ordovician pattern runs in the opposite direction, with the broadly dispersed planktonic specialists suffering disproportionately, is precisely what one might predict if the kill mechanism were specifically tied to surface water UV exposure, rather than to the more conventional drivers of habitat loss associated with sea level change or temperature shift alone. A similar argument has been made regarding the documented effects on Ordovician phytoplankton populations. Estimates derived from the gamma-ray burst modeling suggest that 20 to 60% of the total phytoplankton biomass in the Ordovician Ocean could plausibly have been killed by the kind of sustained UV exposure. Increase, the model predicts, a catastrophic blow to the base of the marine food web that would propagate upward through every trophic level dependent, directly or indirectly, on photosynthetic primary production. Because Ordovician oceans are believed to have been relatively oligotrophic, nutrient-poor, and consequently very clear, with minimal particulate matter to scatter and absorb incoming ultraviolet radiation before it could penetrate to significant depth. The surface and near-surface waters where most photosynthetic activity occurred would have been particularly vulnerable to whatever increase in UV flux a depleted ozone layer permitted to reach the sea surface. The gamma-ray burst hypothesis additionally proposes a connection between the radiation event and the onset of the Hernantian glaciation itself, not merely a parallel, independent catastrophe, but potentially a contributing trigger for the climatic collapse that produced the first extinction pulse. The mechanism proposed involves the destruction, by the same nitrogen oxide chemistry responsible for ozone depletion, of methane in the atmosphere. Methane being, like carbon dioxide, a significant greenhouse gas, and one whose atmospheric concentration during the Ordovician, while not precisely constrained, may have been contributing meaningfully to the warm baseline climate of the period. A sudden, radiation-driven destruction of atmospheric methane, the hypothesis suggests, could have removed enough greenhouse forcing to help trigger or accelerate the transition into the severe glacial state that the geological record documents, potentially unifying what might otherwise appear to be two separate catastrophes, glaciation and radiation exposure, into a single causal chain originating from a single astrophysical trigger. It must be emphasized, with the same rigor that the scientific community itself applies to this hypothesis, that the gamma-ray burst explanation for the late Ordovician extinction remains exactly that, a hypothesis, one among several competing explanations, supported by suggestive but fundamentally indirect evidence, rather than by any direct physical trace of the kind that, for example, the iridium layer and Chicxulub crater provide for the end Cretaceous asteroid impact. There is no equivalent smoking gun for a gamma-ray burst. By the nature of the phenomenon, a gamma-ray burst leaves no crater, no chemical signature comparable to iridium enrichment, no unambiguous physical artifact embedded in the rock record that could, on its own, confirm that such an event occurred. The case for the hypothesis rests instead on the consistency between the predicted biological effects of a hypothetical burst and the observed patterns of extinction and survival in the fossil record, a form of evidence that is genuinely suggestive, but that falls short of the kind of direct physical confirmation that would settle the question definitively. This evidentiary gap is precisely why the gamma-ray burst hypothesis, more than 2 decades after its initial proposal, remains a contested explanation rather than an established consensus. One serious candidate among several, none of which has yet achieved the kind of decisive confirmation that would allow paleontologists to close the case on what triggered Earth's second largest mass extinction. The competing explanations for the trigger of the Hernantian glaciation are grounded in mechanisms considerably more conventional by the standards of Earth system science than a burst of radiation from a dying star, though conventional should not be mistaken for simple or fully resolved, since each of these alternative hypotheses carries its own significant uncertainties and its own body of supporting and complicating evidence. The most actively investigated alternative in recent research centers on volcanism, specifically on geochemical evidence suggesting that a major episode of volcanic activity may have driven the climatic transition into the Hernantian icehouse, through an indirect mechanism involving atmospheric chemistry and the long-term carbon cycle, rather than through the more commonly discussed volcanic mechanism of direct cooling from injected sulfate aerosols. Research examining mercury concentrations preserved in Ordovician-age sedimentary rocks has identified abnormally elevated mercury levels in strata corresponding to the period immediately preceding the onset of glaciation. Mercury is released into the atmosphere by volcanic activity in quantities that can be detected and quantified in the sedimentary record, and anomalous mercury enrichment is now a widely used proxy in the geological sciences for identifying episodes of large-scale volcanism in deep time, even in the absence of directly preserved volcanic rock at a given study location. The presence of such an anomaly in the Ordovician record has led researchers to propose that an episode of large igneous province volcanism, comparable in general character, though not necessarily in scale, to the volcanic events implicated in several other major Phanerozoic extinctions, including the end Permian catastrophe, may have played a significant role in the Ordovician story. The proposed mechanism connecting this volcanism to glaciation, rather than to the warming more commonly associated with volcanic carbon dioxide release, involves the long-term consequences of silicate weathering. Volcanic activity that exposes large volumes of fresh silicate rock to the atmosphere can, over geological timescales, drive an enhancement of the chemical weathering processes that naturally draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide. Rainfall reacting with exposed silicate minerals in reactions that ultimately sequester atmospheric carbon as dissolved bicarbonate, eventually deposited as carbonate sediment on the ocean floor. If volcanic activity in the Ordovician produced large volumes of fresh, rapidly weathering volcanic rock, particularly in tropical settings where weathering rates are naturally highest due to warm, wet conditions, the resulting enhancement of the global silicate weathering rate could plausibly have driven the substantial decline in atmospheric CO2 from approximately 7,000 to approximately 4,400 parts per million that the geochemical record indicates preceded the glacial onset. Under this model, volcanism is not a direct cooling agent through aerosol injection, as is often the case in shorter timescale volcanic climate effects, but rather an indirect cooling agent operating through its long-term modification of the global carbon cycle via enhanced weathering. A mechanism requiring not years or decades, but hundreds of thousands to millions of years to produce its full climatic effect, a timescale broadly consistent with the apparent duration of the CO2 decline documented in Ordovician sediments. A related but distinct line of investigation focuses on tectonic uplift as a driver of enhanced weathering, independent of any specific volcanic trigger. The Ordovician period was a time of significant tectonic activity along several continental margins, including episodes of mountain building associated with the collision and convergence of various continental fragments within the complex Iapetus ocean system. The uplift of mountain ranges exposes large volumes of fresh rock to physical and chemical weathering, and several researchers have proposed that Ordovician orogenic mountain building events may have contributed to enhanced global weathering rates and consequent CO2 drawdown through essentially the same chemical mechanism proposed for the volcanic hypothesis, but driven by tectonic rather than purely volcanic processes. These two hypotheses, volcanically enhanced weathering and tectonically enhanced weathering, are not mutually exclusive, and indeed may have operated in tandem, with volcanic activity itself frequently being a direct consequence of the same plate tectonic processes responsible for mountain building, making a clean separation between the two proposed mechanisms somewhat artificial in practice. A third, considerably more speculative hypothesis, which received renewed attention from researchers in recent analysis of Ordovician sedimentary patterns, proposes an entirely different and genuinely unusual mechanism. The possibility that Earth, during the Middle Ordovician, may have developed a ring system, a band of orbiting debris encircling the planet's equatorial plane, broadly analogous in general structure, though presumably vastly smaller in scale, to the prominent ring system currently observed around Saturn. This hypothesis draws on an unusual pattern in the distribution of Ordovician impact craters, which appear disproportionately concentrated near the paleo-equator of the period, a distribution pattern that some researchers have argued is more consistent with debris falling from a low-inclination orbital ring than with the expectation of a roughly random global distribution that simple asteroid bombardment, unaffected by any orbital debris structure, would be expected to produce. Under this hypothesis, such a ring, potentially formed from the debris of a large asteroid or comet that passed within Earth's Roche limit and was tidally disrupted into orbiting fragments, could have cast a persistent shadow across portions of Earth's surface, particularly affecting the higher latitudes during the relevant hemisphere's winter season, when the geometry of Earth's orbital tilt would have placed the winter hemisphere more directly within the ring's shadow. The proposed climatic consequence is a reduction in solar energy reaching the shadowed regions, potentially contributing to the kind of global cooling trend that preceded the Hernantian glacial maximum. This ring hypothesis remains, it should be emphasized clearly, considerably more speculative and substantially less broadly accepted within the geological community than either the volcanic or tectonic weathering hypotheses, let alone compared to the basic, well-established fact of the Hernantian glaciation itself. The crater distribution pattern on which it rests is itself a matter of ongoing investigation and debate, given the inherent difficulty of compiling a complete and unbiased global catalogue of impact structures, from rocks as old and as variably preserved as those of the mid-Ordovician. Nonetheless, the hypothesis illustrates something important about the current state of scientific understanding regarding the Late Ordovician extinction. More than a century after the basic outlines of the event were first recognized in the stratigraphic record, and more than 2 decades after the gamma-ray burst hypothesis introduced an explicitly astrophysical dimension to the debate, researchers continue to propose and investigate genuinely novel mechanisms, reflecting the reality that no single explanation has yet achieved the kind of decisive, broadly accepted confirmation that would close the case. What can be said with considerably greater confidence, because it rests on direct physical and chemical evidence from the rock record, rather than on inference about ultimate atmospheric or astrophysical triggers, is the sequence of events that followed whatever set the Hernantian glaciation in motion. The growth of the Gondwanan ice sheet, however it was triggered, produced the dramatic sea level fall, the severe tropical cooling, and the corresponding habitat loss that account for the first extinction pulse, with a degree of mechanistic clarity that does not depend on resolving the gamma-ray burst question. And the subsequent melting of that ice sheet, with its associated sea level rise and oceanic anoxia, accounts for the second pulse with similarly direct physical and geochemical support. The genuinely unresolved question, the question that makes the Late Ordovician extinction uniquely compelling among the major extinction events of Earth history, is not what happened in the broad outline of glaciation followed by deglaciation and anoxia, but why it happened. What specific combination of volcanic, tectonic, orbital, or conceivably even astrophysical factors pushed the Ordovician climate system across the threshold from sustained greenhouse stability into the most severe glaciation of the entire Phanerozoic eon. The second extinction pulse, occurring as the Hernantian glaciation came to its end, deserves examination in its own right, because the mechanism that drove it, widespread oceanic anoxia accompanying rapid deglaciation, represents a distinct category of extinction driver from the cold and sea level fall mechanism of the first pulse. And because the organisms it killed tell their own particular story about the unpredictability of survival through compound environmental catastrophe. As the massive Gondwanan ice sheet began to melt, the resulting influx of cold, fresh meltwater into the global ocean, combined with rapidly rising sea levels reflooding the continental shelves that had been exposed during the glacial maximum, appears to have triggered a significant disruption of normal ocean circulation patterns. Research examining the geochemical signatures preserved in latest Ordovician and earliest Silurian marine sediments has documented widespread evidence of anoxia, the depletion or complete absence of dissolved oxygen, affecting large volumes of seawater across multiple ocean basins during this interval. The mechanisms proposed to explain this anoxic episode include the disruption of the thermohaline circulation patterns that, under normal conditions, work to ventilate the deep ocean by drawing oxygen-rich surface water downward. The upwelling of long-stagnant, oxygen-depleted, nutrient-rich deep water into shallower environments as circulation patterns reorganized, and the broader oceanographic consequences of transitioning within a geologically brief interval from icehouse to a renewed warmer climate state, with all the associated reorganization of ocean stratification and current patterns that such a transition entails. The consequences for marine life were severe and, in an important sense, cruelly ironic. The Hernantia fauna, the distinctive assemblage of cold-adapted brachiopods and trilobites that had successfully colonized the glacially influenced seas of the Hernantian interval, filling ecological roles left vacant by the extinction of warm water specialists during the first pulse, found itself precisely positioned to be devastated by the warming, anoxic conditions that accompanied the glaciation's end. Organisms that had invested evolutionary and ecological capital in cold water adaptation were poorly equipped to cope with a return to warmer conditions, particularly when that warming was compounded by the additional stress of severe oxygen depletion in the waters they inhabited. In effect, the very adaptations that had allowed certain lineages to survive the first pulse of the catastrophe became a liability when the climate system reversed course, exposing those same survivors to a second, mechanistically distinct wave of environmental devastation, for which their recent evolutionary history had left them poorly prepared. The pattern of survival and extinction across the complete two-pulse event, when examined in detail across multiple taxonomic groups, reveals a complex picture that resists simple, single-factor explanation, a finding that itself supports the view that the late Ordovician catastrophe likely involved the compounding effects of multiple, mechanistically distinct stresses, rather than a single uniform killing mechanism applied evenly across all of Ordovician marine life. Among the graptolites, The extinction produced one of the most dramatic faunal turnovers documented in the group's evolutionary history. The diverse assemblage of graptolite families that had dominated Ordovician plankton communities, collectively referred to by specialists using the shorthand DDO fauna, after the dominant families Dicranograptidae, Diplograptidae, and Orthograptidae, was almost entirely eliminated, to be replaced in the immediate aftermath of the extinction by a comparatively impoverished fauna, dominated by the family Normalograptidae. A transition so abrupt and so complete that it serves paleontologists as one of the clearest biostratigraphic markers for identifying the Ordovician-Silurian boundary in sediments around the world. Among the trilobites, the pattern already described held throughout the extinction. Trilobite lineages employing an intermediate developmental strategy involving a brief planktonic phase followed by settlement to a benthic existence suffered intermediate rates of extinction, and these intermediate strategy lineages went on to contribute disproportionately to the post-extinction recovery fauna, accounting for a substantial fraction of the new trilobite genera that appeared in the early Silurian as biodiversity began its long, slow climb back from the catastrophic losses of the Hernantian interval. The brachiopods, meanwhile, document the broader pattern of selective survival tied to environmental tolerance that characterizes the event as a whole. Genera capable of tolerating the cold, often nutrient-poor conditions associated with glacial interval seas, survived the first pulse in disproportionate numbers, contributing the bulk of the distinctive Hernantia brachiopod fauna, only for many of these same cold-tolerant survivors to be eliminated in turn during the second pulse, as the anoxic, rapidly warming conditions of deglaciation imposed an entirely different, and for many of these cold specialists, equally lethal set of environmental demands. The recovery from the late Ordovician extinction, once the immediate crisis of the second pulse had passed, unfolded over a period of several million years into the early Silurian, as surviving lineages diversified to refill the ecological roles left vacant by the catastrophe, and as entirely new lineages emerged to exploit opportunities created by the restructured post-extinction marine ecosystem. This recovery, while real and eventually substantial, proceeded against the backdrop of a marine biosphere whose taxonomic composition had been permanently altered. Certain lineages that had been prominent components of pre-extinction Ordovician ecosystems never recovered their former diversity or ecological dominance, while other lineages that had been comparatively minor players before the catastrophe found themselves positioned, whether through fortunate pre-adaptation or simple chance, to expand into the ecological space the extinction had vacated. It is worth stating plainly, as a final accounting of the scale of what occurred, that the late Ordovician extinction's position as the second largest mass extinction in the history of complex animal life is not a matter of serious scientific dispute. However contested the question of ultimate cause remains. The 85% species-level loss documented across the combined two pulses of the event represents a catastrophic restructuring of the marine biosphere, achieved within a geological interval, estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 million years for the complete event, encompassing both pulses and the partial recovery interval between them. That is genuinely brief by the standards of deep time, even if it would represent an inconceivably long span by the standards of human historical experience. The Great Ordovician biodiversification event had spent tens of millions of years constructing one of the richest marine ecosystems the planet had yet produced. The catastrophe that followed dismantled a substantial fraction of that achievement, in a fraction of the time it had taken to build, leaving behind a profoundly altered marine world that the surviving lineages of the early Silurian would spend the subsequent several million years working to rebuild. Why then, given this scale of destruction, given that it exceeds, by the standard metric of species loss, the extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs, does the late Ordovician extinction remain so comparatively obscure in public awareness? Part of the answer is simply temporal distance and its consequences for the fossil record. An event 445 million years old has had vastly more geological time in which to be eroded, subducted, metamorphosed, or otherwise obscured than an event 66 million years old, leaving paleontologists working with a coarser, less complete, and more difficult to interpret record than that available for the end Cretaceous catastrophe. Part of the answer lies in the absence of large, visually dramatic victims comparable to the dinosaurs. The organisms eliminated in the late Ordovician event were, however biologically significant, predominantly small marine invertebrates, whose loss, while catastrophic in ecological terms, does not generate the same emotional resonance in popular culture that the image of a dying Tyrannosaurus does. And part of the answer, perhaps the most intellectually significant part, lies precisely in the unresolved nature of its cause. An extinction event without a settled, simple, single-sentence explanation is, paradoxically, a harder story to tell in the format that popular science communication typically favors. Even though, for the scientifically curious, that very unresolved status is what makes the late Ordovician extinction one of the most genuinely compelling open questions remaining in the entire field of paleontology. What the late Ordovician extinction offers, in the end, is not a tidy resolution, but an honest demonstration of how science actually works at the frontier of genuine uncertainty. Multiple hypotheses remain in active contention, each grounded in real evidence, each facing real limitations, none yet capable of being definitively ruled out or definitively confirmed. The glaciation itself is not in doubt. Its physical traces, in the form of glacial deposits, sea level signatures, and oxygen isotope shifts, are unambiguous and well documented across multiple continents. What triggered it remains genuinely open. Volcanic activity driving enhanced silicate weathering. Tectonic uplift accomplishing much the same end through a related mechanism. The more exotic possibility of an equatorial ring system shadowing the planet, or the hypothesis that elevates this extinction event into a category distinct from every other major catastrophe in the history of complex life. A burst of gamma radiation from a dying star, its energy crossing thousands of light years of empty space to strike a young, biologically thriving planet, and in doing so, potentially rewriting the entire subsequent trajectory of evolution on Earth. There is something worth sitting with in the implications of the gamma ray burst hypothesis, even, especially, given its unresolved status, because it reframes the question of planetary vulnerability in a way that few other proposed extinction mechanisms in Earth's history managed to do. An asteroid impact, however catastrophic, originates from within the solar system, following an orbit that, with sufficient observational effort, can in principle be tracked, characterized, and in some scenarios even deflected given adequate warning time. A supervolcanic eruption originates from processes occurring within Earth's own interior, driven by the planet's internal heat budget. And while its timing cannot be precisely predicted, its general locations of risk, the world's major volcanic hotspots and rift zones, are known and continuously monitored. A gamma-ray burst originating from a dying star, several thousand light-years away, offers no comparable possibility of advance warning whatsoever, because the gamma radiation itself travels at the speed of light, the same speed at which any conceivable observation of the originating stellar event would also reach Earth. There is, in the most literal sense, no early warning system possible for a threat of this kind. By the time any instrument on Earth could detect the burst's lethal radiation would already be arriving simultaneously. Modern astronomical instruments do, in fact, detect gamma-ray bursts on a regular basis, providing some empirical grounding for understanding how such events actually present themselves when they occur within range of our observational capabilities, even though none observed in the modern era has been energetic enough or sufficiently well aimed to pose a threat to Earth. The Fermi Gamma-Ray Space Telescope and its predecessor missions have catalogued thousands of gamma-ray bursts since systematic space-based monitoring began, the vast majority originating from galaxies far beyond our own, at distances measured in billions rather than thousands of light-years. Distances so vast that even an extraordinarily powerful burst would arrive at Earth too attenuated to cause any meaningful atmospheric or biological effect. The relatively small number of gamma-ray bursts detected at distances within our own galaxy, or in galaxies near enough to be considered potentially hazardous, has allowed astronomers to refine their estimates of how frequently a genuinely dangerous, well-aimed burst might be expected to occur. Estimates that, while necessarily uncertain given the small sample size of nearby events observed to date, remain broadly consistent with the original Melot and Lieberman calculation of roughly one potentially hazardous event every several 100 million years. A frequency low enough that most paleontologists regard it as entirely plausible that such an event has occurred at least once across the more than 500 million years of complex animal life that Earth's fossil record documents, without requiring it to have occurred more than once, or indeed requiring it to have occurred specifically during the Late Ordovician at all. The most thoroughly studied real-world gamma-ray burst observed in recent astronomical history, designated GRB221009A, and detected in October of 2022, originated from a galaxy approximately 2 billion light-years from Earth, and was, despite this enormous distance, sufficiently energetic to produce measurable disturbances in Earth's ionosphere, the electrically charged upper layer of the atmosphere, demonstrating empirically that gamma-ray bursts occurring at even very great distances are capable of producing detectable atmospheric effects on Earth. This event, sometimes informally referred to by astronomers as the boat, the brightest of all time, reflecting its status as the most energetic gamma-ray burst, yet recorded by modern instruments, provides a genuine, observationally confirmed data point, illustrating the kind of atmospheric interaction the gamma-ray burst hypothesis for the Ordovician extinction proposes, even though GRB2210009A itself, at 2 billion light-years remove, posed no biological threat whatsoever to life on Earth. The contrast between this observed, harmless, extraordinarily distant event and the hypothesized Ordovician scenario, a burst originating not billions, but mere thousands of light-years away, close enough and precisely enough aimed to deliver biologically significant radiation, rather than a barely measurable ionospheric ripple, illustrates both why the hypothesis remains physically plausible in general terms, and why the specific combination of proximity and aim required to produce a mass extinction-level event is, by the nature of the geometry involved, a genuinely rare astronomical coincidence. What this means, in practical terms, for any consideration of present-day risk, is appropriately reassuring. The galactic environment in the immediate vicinity of the solar system today does not appear to contain any star in the specific evolutionary stage, believed most likely to produce a long-duration gamma-ray burst, typically a massive, rapidly rotating star nearing the catastrophic end of its nuclear fusion lifetime, within the distance range that would be required to pose a genuine threat based on current astronomical surveys of nearby stellar populations. The Ordovician scenario, if it occurred as the hypothesis proposes, would have required not merely the presence of a suitable progenitor star within the danger radius, but the additional, vanishingly improbable geometric coincidence of that star's eventual collapse, producing a burst whose narrow emission jet happened to be aimed, with real precision, directly at a small rocky planet orbiting an entirely unrelated star thousands of light-years away. A reminder that even genuinely rare astronomical catastrophes, given sufficient spans of geological time, may eventually find their target, however vanishingly small the odds may have been in any single moment. We do not know, with the certainty that science ultimately seeks, which of these explanations, or what combination of them, is correct. What we know is that something struck the Ordovician world with sufficient force to eliminate 85% of the species then alive, that the proximate mechanism involved an extraordinarily severe glaciation, followed by an equally severe episode of oceanic anoxia, and that among the candidate triggers for this catastrophe is an event so vast in scale and so alien to ordinary planetary experience that its mere consideration as a serious scientific hypothesis tells us something important about the nature of the universe our planet inhabits. A universe in which the deep history of life on Earth may not be entirely a local story, confined to the geological and biological processes of this one planet, but may instead be, at least occasionally, a story shaped by forces originating thousands of light-years away, in the death throes of stars whose light and whose lethal radiation took millennia to cross the gulf of space, before arriving, without warning, at a small, blue, living world.